So we already looked at some art by Wayne Thiebaud, and he is an artist who makes all of those really gorgeous dessert paintings, and they look very realistic. And the way he makes it look realistic is because he adds tints and shades, and that's to add highlights and shadows. So we're gonna be doing the same thing with our own version of a cupcake. Now, I already created these stencils for you if you choose to use it, because the most important part of this project is making them look 3D. The shape of it is not really the most important part, so if it makes it a little easier for you to do that, of course you can use this stencil. You also can use it as a little bit of a guide. So I'm gonna place my stencil on my paper exactly where I want to draw my cupcake, and I'm gonna trace around it really lightly because I'm just gonna use this as a shape and size guide. Then you can always adjust it accordingly to how you want it to be. So as I shape this out, again, I'm just gonna make my lines a little bit darker and really touch up exactly where I'm choosing to have them. And I'm also gonna start to add that icing line where I want the icing to be. So I'm gonna finish that off on the bottom, but now I'm gonna work with this area. So I'm gonna start with one of these little points, and I'm gonna have it tilt downward like a diagonal line. Okay, and that's gonna be like one of those swirls. And then I'm gonna go to my next one, and I'm gonna attach it to my other corner. Again, slanting down a little bit. And I'm gonna do the same thing on my next corner. Little diagonal curve. And then this one is just gonna be that little loop on top. I'm also gonna decide where I want my horizon line to be, or where that tabletop is gonna be. So I'm deciding to put mine here, jump over, and now my sketch is ready to start adding color. Now for the next part of our project, we're gonna start to add color, and we're gonna do something called underpainting before we do anything. Underpainting is gonna give our entire picture a base color that we're gonna just keep building on after we create that background. And this is something that Wayne Thiebaud also did for his paintings. So we're gonna do that with watercolors because that's not gonna give us too strong of a color, and then we can build on top of that. So we wanna think of one color that we want the icing to be and one color that we want that wrapper to be. So once you decide on those two colors, you're gonna pick your watercolors and create your underpainting for the icing and your underpainting for the wrapper. So I picked a color for the icing and I picked a color for the wrapper. And I want you to notice the brush strokes that I did. So when I was painting, I wasn't doing tiny little sections, right? I was using long, smooth brush strokes. That way it gives that effect like the icing is wrapping around. Now for the next layer of our painting, we're gonna be adding shadows to our underpainting that we already did. So when we're doing shadows, we want to make sure that the color we used gets darker, because that's going to be the part that looks like no light is hitting it. So when we're doing dark and light with watercolors, we really have to have a lot of control over the amount of water that we use, because the more water that's on our brush, it's going to be a lot lighter, just like we see in these sections. And then the parts that are darker are gonna have much less water, like you can see right over here. So that's gonna be the biggest part of our second layer of adding our painting. Now on each swirl, so I'm gonna consider this 1, this 2, this 3, and this 4. On each one of these sections, we wanna add a shadow to the bottom of the section. and that's gonna make it look a little more 3D. So I'm just gonna take my water and wet my brush a very little bit. Okay, I'm gonna wipe off the excess water because I don't want a lot of water on my brush. I wanna make the color dark. So I'm gonna find the color I did for the icing, which is this one right here. I'm gonna wiggle it a lot in the paint. And when I say a lot, it just means that it's enough where it's not so watery. It's not like a puddle of water. More of that color is on my brush, okay? And it's not dripping wet. And that's gonna help me make that shadow effect. So now I'm just gonna go ahead and I'm gonna start adding the dark shadow to the bottom part of that section. And you'll see how much darker it is just because I used very little water with it. Now, of course, if you want to blend it out a little bit, you can take the tiniest bit of water. You can see I really dip that in very lightly, and then you can spread it out a little bit. And just by doing that, you'll see that it blends that dark color a little better. You just have to really have a lot of control with this, because if you don't control it, it's just gonna make that whole section look the same. And we really wanna make that part look like a shadow and stand out. So when you feel like your shadow section is exactly where you want it, then you can stop right there. Now I'm gonna go ahead and repeat those steps for the next 3 sections. And again, I can always go back with a little water if I feel it's too dark at the end. I think I'm just gonna go ahead and make it really dark to start with, and then I can always touch up what I want afterwards. So I'll go ahead and just finish that for the next few sections. Now, as that top part is drying, we're gonna move to the bottom wrapper, okay? And as we're doing all of these layers of water and of watercolor paint, you wanna just be aware not to make it too wet, because as soon as you start to see that the paper is getting weaker, meaning there are those little crumbles of paper starting to form on your art, then I would stop in that section because it's gonna start to get a little too wet and you definitely don't wanna rip your paper. But you can see by doing enough of it, just a little bit of it, it really starts to make it pop out. So now for the bottom, the only thing that you're gonna do differently is that we're just gonna make lines. And these do not have to be perfect lines because again, this is only one step of the project. We're gonna add one more step after this, but we wanna add some darker lines just to one side of our cupcake. And you'll notice that this is the side that looks a little more like there's a shadow, right? This side is a little less of a shadow. So if you have more shadow on one side, that's gonna be the side where you add those dark lines. So in my case, I'm making my shadow look more to the right, so I'm gonna add those lines more to the right. So now that I added shadow to my cupcake icing and also to the wrapper, I'm gonna be using oil pastels to add a little more shadow, but especially to add the highlights, which are the parts that are gonna be lighter, the different tints that we wanna add to make the highlighted part stand out a little more and make our cupcake look a little more 3D. So I'm gonna start out with the icing and then work my way down the cupcake. So since I used pink for my icing, I really have 2 options. I can use white for my highlights, and I'm definitely gonna be using white, but I also can look and see if there's a different color oil pastel that's a lighter version of my color. Now the pink that I have here is really not that light. It might not really work so well for mine, but if you have something that's like a darker blue or darker, like a darker orange, you might be able to use one of these lighter shades of oil pastels if you have that available. Now, as we already talked about, the bottom of each of these icing sections was done with our darker paint to make it look like it's a shadow, like light is not hitting it as much. So I'm gonna go ahead and take my white now, and I'm gonna be putting white in the opposite of the bottom, which would be the top of each section. So I'm gonna just go ahead and start adding a little bit of white just to the top of each section. And I want to be careful to not make it look so neat. I actually want to leave a little bit of a jagged edge there so that it doesn't look like it's perfect. I want to just add a little bit of that messy edge on the bottom to make it look like it's blended out a little bit. Now you can probably see already that it's looking a little bit more 3D just by adding this white. And I'm gonna be careful to not get messy toward the top, right? Because that's gonna be the bottom of the icing from the other layer above it. So I wanna keep the top part clean, but then the bottom is a little more jagged, just so it can blend into the shadow that I already did. So you can go around and just play around with it. See where you want to add more. Make sure you get each of your sections there. You could even take your finger and kind of like blend it out a little bit. There's no rules for this. Just kind of play around and see how to get your best highlight effect. So I finished all of my white oil pastel, and if I want, I'm gonna go ahead with that other pink color, or whatever color you chose, and I'm gonna just go over the middle a little bit, where that highlight and that shadow meet. And that might just help it like blend out a little more so that it's not so separate. And you might see that that just blends it a little bit better. Now I also want to point out that there are some parts that I pressed a little harder with my oil pastel and some parts where I didn't. So you can also experiment with the pressure that you put on your oil pastel. It'll give it different values if you do that. And you also don't have to be so neat with this. So you could see I kind of scattered some here, I scattered some here. I didn't do any over here. So again, this is really just something you're going to experiment with as you go along. So I selected some blues, some light blues, some dark blues. And as you can see, I already added most of my shadow here, but now I'm going to go in with those lighter blues and also darker blues to make my shadow even more and also to add some of my highlights here. So let me start with the lighter one first. So I'm going to start with my highlights, and I'm going to do my highlights on the opposite section from my shadows. So again, this isn't anything super specific. You're just kind of going to scatter those lines around. You want to keep them kind of neat, but they're not meant to be perfectly straight because in real life that wouldn't make it look real. Okay, so they're meant to be a little bit crooked, and you could already start to see that adds a little more dimension there. If you want to put one or two in the shadow part, that's fine as well. I would just keep most of your light ones toward the other side. Now I'll go ahead and just add some more with my other two colors, scattering them around and keeping the darker ones toward that shadow side. So now that I've finished my oil pastels, you can see that the cupcake really looks a lot more realistic. There's more color added to it. There's lights and darks, there's value, and it gives it a much more realistic feel. So now I'm gonna go to my background. And my background, I'm gonna choose two more colors. And you could feel free to mix paints, but we're gonna be using tempera paint. And tempera paint is gonna come out a little thicker than we did for the watercolors for our cupcake. So we're gonna just go around our shape really neatly. One color for the top, one color for the bottom. So I got green and white because I wanna mix it together to make a lighter green for my background. And then I'm also going to do brown for my ground, which in this case would be a table. I want to make it look like it's sitting on a table. So I'm going to go ahead and paint those two sections. Okay, so I painted the background, and the other thing I'm gonna do before I'm done painting is I wanna add a little bit of a shadow to make it look a little more realistic, just like we did to the actual cupcake. So I used like a light brown for my table. I'm just gonna take a regular brown. And whatever color you did, you're just gonna make it a little darker. So you can either take that regular color if you added white to it for the table, or you could even add a little black to it to make it a little darker. But I'm just gonna take regular brown since I used a lighter brown, and I'm gonna add a little bit of a shadow in the shape of an oval, kind of going around the bottom right of my cupcake. And if you made your shadows to the left, then obviously you'll do this on the left. Now the final part of our project, which is gonna be really fun and a little different, is we're going to paint and draw something in the same exact style that we did the cupcake, but we're gonna make something smaller to put inside the cupcake so that it's sticking out of the icing. So I decided to do a chocolate chip cookie. And like I said, I did it exactly the same style that we did the cupcake. I took watercolors and I just painted one shade of light brown inside of my circle that I drew with a pencil. And then once that was dry, I went over it with oil pastels. So I used like a tan, like a very, very light brown on the edge here. I used a little bit of a darker brown on the edge here. Just really lightly added a little bit to the sides to make it look a little more real. And then with a dark brown, I just added these little chocolate chip shapes. So now the next thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use my scissors and carefully cut it out right along the edge so that I don't see any white space outside of my shape that I did. Now, as I'm cutting this out, I also want to mention that you can really put anything coming out of your cupcake. You can make it more realistic, or you can make it not so realistic, or really extravagant. So you can do a piece of fruit, you can do a candy, you can do a cookie like I did. You could even have like a muffin coming out. It's really anything that you want. The key is just to do it smaller and do the same thing with the paint and then the oil pastels. Now this is where the fun part comes in. You're gonna decide what side you want to have your object coming out of your cupcake. And we're gonna give it a very 3D effect because we're actually going to be cutting a little slit so that we can stick our piece of paper inside of that little slit, and it's gonna look like it's actually popping out. And it might not even fit on our paper. It might actually be hanging off of the paper for another added effect. So decide on which side you wanna do it, and then an adult, a teacher, is going to be cutting on a piece of cardboard behind your paper with your art on top of it, and they're gonna use a blade. Now this is a very, very, very sharp blade. It's called an X-Acto knife. Sometimes it comes in a roller form and sometimes it comes just on a stick. However, no kid is allowed to touch this. This is only for teachers to use. Now, if you look closely, you can see there's a very little line right against the icing that I cut with this. I'm all done, so I'm gonna close it on up, and then I don't have to cut anything else. I'm also gonna remove my background, background of the cardboard that I used to protect the table. So now, I'm gonna put this in where I have my little slot. And you can see that it looks like it's actually in the icing now, and it's sticking out. And again, it does not have to fit on your paper. It's meant to go off. So now I'm gonna get a little bit of glue, glue that down, and then I'm gonna be done with the project. So I glued down the cookie, and the final step, just flip it over. And even though there's gonna be some glue on the parts that aren't attached to your paper, that's fine. Just rub it into place wherever it is glued down so that it's nice and flat. And then you have your finished piece of art.